part of the gold medal team at the 2016 Games, but she believes her love of the sport was tainted by her coach Maggie Haney, who is now suspended by the Sports American Federation. For the longest time, Lori Hernandez believed she was crazy for thinking that her coach had emotionally abused her. On many occasions when her coach screamed at her for the tiniest mistakes or lapses in focus, calling her weak, lazy, or messed up in the head, Hernandez rationalized that all top coaches push their young gymnasts this way. There were many times when she stood frozen, bawling at the gym, her heart racing as she struggled to breathe, scared to do anything that would trigger her coach's wrath. Hernandez, an adolescent at the time, assuming she could not handle the pressure. She was convinced from a young age that this was how Olympians were made. When Hernandez would speak up about the mistreatment, her coach would tell her to stop taking things so personally. She later stated, "The toughest part was that there were no bruises or marks to show that it was real. It was also twisted. I thought it couldn't be real." Whenever Hernandez would go to her mother about the abuse, her mother would try to talk to her coach. The next day, her coach would show up in a rage, telling Hernandez, "So your mother called me," and then proceeded to punish the entire team by assigning extra conditioning work. The yelling eventually became body shaming as Lori got older, causing her to develop eating disorders. This resulted in countless injuries she was forced to continue training through. She later changed coaches, and for the first time ever, she got a coach who cared about her well-being. She later said in an interview, "I now have to relearn what I thought was good this whole time, and it was not. It was just behavior that I learned to adapt to or something that I was taught that's not actually right." Being in that environment from age 5 to 16, those are my developmental years, so there's just a lot of unlearning that is constantly happening. Is this really what we want our young and vulnerable athletes to be exposed to? Are all the gold medals in gymnastics ultimately worth it under these horrible conditions that young gymnasts are being put through? The USA Gymnastics organization needs to do a better job protecting athletes from emotional abuse by adjusting its coaching policies and enforcing a coaching license through strict screening to create a positive and healthy environment that allows the growth of athletes. Emotional abuse within the context of sports can be difficult to define, and existing research uses various definitions of this form of abuse. Other names for it include mental or psychological abuse, and it appears to be very similar to bullying. Here is a definition that has been proposed by the research literature. Emotional abuse includes non-physical behaviors that are meant to control, isolate, or frighten you, including threats, insults, constant monitoring, excessive jealousy, manipulation, humiliation, intimidation, and dismissiveness, among many others. Abuse comes in many different forms. Even when there's no physical violence, abusive language can be very damaging. Emotional and psychological abuse is hard to recognize because the abuse is spread throughout your everyday interactions. Unlike physical abuse, there are often no isolated incidences or clear physical evidence to reference. A survey on emotional abuse went out in June of 2022 to current and former gymnasts. More than 50% reported an element of emotional abuse by coaches, such as swearing, name-calling, use of belittling languages, and gaslighting. And more than 25% included references to excessive weight management. Some of these athletes that reported the abuse described being made to stand on the beam for 2 hours because she was frightened to attempt a skill. Some gymnasts were strapped to bars for extended periods of time, while others were made to climb the rope because they exceeded break time. One gymnast recalls at the age of 7 being sat on by a coach, while a parent reported 2 coaches at once pushing their child's legs down in a split. And an international competitor recalled their coach sitting on a gymnast's back, forcing their hips to the floor, and then lifting up their knee. No young athlete should be subjected to this way of coaching. The first women competed in artistic gymnastics in the 1928 Olympics. This was a team of fully grown women. If you go back and analyze the videos from the Olympics in the 20th century, you can see the athletic standards change over time. The standard went from fully grown women to girls as young as 14, being forced to keep a slim and small body to help them perform better. As we move into the 21st century, we can see that the slim and small body type fades from the standard. However, the age of girls has still remained the same. The young start age of gymnasts makes athletes extremely vulnerable. Gymnastics is a sport that takes a certain type of personality. Gymnasts must have a good work ethic, a love-hate relationship with fear, strive for perfection, and be able to push their bodies to their limits. Gymnasts put in hundreds of hours of work preparing for the opportunity to put themselves on a stage, to have every aspect of their performance watched, judged, and yet gymnasts wouldn't want it any other way, or maybe they do secretly. Gymnastics is like being in a one-sided relationship. It takes way more than it gives back to the gymnast, and whatever it needs from the gymnasts, they give it. When it does give back, it gives a feeling that reaches straight into their souls. The little tastes of success are enough to keep them working and get them addicted. I began gymnastics when I was 3 years old. Like many other young gymnasts, I was willing to give anything and everything. It was like an addiction I couldn't get away from. There are about 4.7 million gymnasts in the U.S., according to the Sports and Fitness Industries Association's 2019 Gymnastics Participation Report. Around 49% of those athletes are between the ages of 6 and 12. Children at this age are unable to rationalize well, are more susceptible to believing that emotional abuse is a normal and acceptable form of coaching. USA Gymnastics needs to do a better job of protecting athletes from emotional abuse and change its coaching policies, because the current policies allow coaches to emotionally harm the athlete. Eating disorders, body shaming, cussing, punishment for mental blocks, manipulation from emotional abuse can lead to other forms of abuse, and it strips the love of the sport away from the athlete. However, many of the top coaches claim that their coaching style is not abusive, and that they only do it to help the athletes be the best they can be. Little do they know, they are only causing more damage to the athlete's well-being. Many coaches may engage in emotionally abusive behaviors under the guise of winning at all costs, but these behaviors are often inappropriate and harmful to the athlete. Could you imagine a boss that throws objects and publicly degrades workers for the sake of increasing productivity in the workplace? These types of behaviors would not be acceptable in an office setting, in a romantic or familial relationship, in the military or armed forces, or in any other setting. So why should they be allowed in gymnastics, especially in children's gymnastics? There are often times when an athlete will see their coach more than their parents. This often was the case for me. I would leave for school at 7:30 in the morning, then I would drive straight from school to gymnastics, and then finally get home around 9 p.m. Think of how much influence your parents have on you. Whether or not it is a positive influence, it is an influence that greatly affects you. A coach that is cussing at you and yelling at you for every mistake you make, or for being scared of a skill, will have a negative impact on you mentally. Many USA Gymnastics coaches deny any emotional abuse done and claim that it makes their athletes better. One of these coaches was named Maggie Haney. She was the coach of the gymnast I mentioned earlier, Lori Hernandez. Haney was an Olympic coach who was suspended after allegations of emotional abuse. If she could travel back in time, before she was suspended from gymnastics after being accused of berating and mistreating her athletes, Maggie Haney says that she would have changed the way she coached. She quotes, "I think my mistakes were that I cared too much and wanted them to be a little too perfect every day, but maybe that wasn't possible." Haney, one of the most prominent coaches in the sport, said in an interview with the New York Times, the first time she had spoken publicly in nearly a year, "Maybe what used to be okay is not okay anymore, and maybe it shouldn't be. I think maybe the culture has shifted." Haney believes that she was wrongfully removed from her coaching position. However, many of her athletes believe that she should have been removed much sooner. If Haney had cared too much for her athletes as she had claimed, she would have cared about who they were as people rather than their athletic ability. Emotionally abusing athletes does not help them, it hurts them. Oftentimes, many of the coaches who are emotionally abusive will manipulate the athlete by putting their own reputation on the backs of their athlete. As human beings, our brains are not fully developed until our mid-20s. Any teenager or young athlete cannot and should not be performing for the sake of keeping the coach's reputation. They are too young to even be able to comprehend and too mentally unstable to withhold that kind of pressure. Coaches should want a reputation for their character, for being encouraging, and for helping the athletes grow as people, rather than just a reputation for producing gold medal athletes who in reality are only miserable. Top British gymnasts were interviewed about their own experiences in gymnastics, saying, "The culture of winning and criteria for success has created a cycle that perpetuates abusive practices, portraying them as acceptable and at times necessary within gymnastics. When children and their families gain access to elite expertise, they know many others are waiting to take their place. This can encourage compliance. Continued selection in these systems means accepting how things are done. Because success is so desired, when it is achieved, uncompromising coaching practices and abusive coach-athlete relationships may be reimagined as effective coaching, this success only deemed possible because of those practices." The British gymnasts have also referred to the fear of rocking the boat and the need to remain silent to avoid losing their place on the team, resulting in athletes who are afraid to speak out because of the consequences it may have on their career. Over time, this resulted in athletes losing their love for the sport that they had done since they were able to walk. They had given so much for the sport, and it was almost like it was taken in an instant by a coach. The current policies allow coaches to emotionally harm athletes in ways such as eating disorders, body shaming, and punishment for mental blocks. A study conducted showed that elite female gymnasts are more likely than any other athlete to develop an eating disorder. Gymnastics is a weight-sensitive and weight-bearing sport because the gymnasts must lift their own body weight against gravity. All women's gymnastics disciplines require specific performance characteristics, such as strength, flexibility, balance, and movement precision. Low body weight and especially a low fat mass, combined with muscle strength and power, are considered beneficial technique because they increase the power to weight ratio. This is critical for optimal gymnastics performance since athletes must rapidly transfer their body mass across space while overcoming gravitational resistance. However, coaches are going to extreme lengths to ensure that their athletes are eating as little as possible to weigh as little as possible. A situation that hits close to home for me personally involved a gymnast named Christy Henrik. She trained at Great American Gymnastics Express, or what many people know today as Gage Gymnastics, located in Blue Springs, Missouri. She was coached by a well-known coach today named Al Fong, who is famous for producing top-level Olympic athletes. Though Henrik was succeeding in gymnastics, a judge at an international meet in 1989 told her bluntly that she was fat and needed to lose weight. For reference, she was 4'10" and only weighed 95 pounds at the time. The perception of Henrik's weight being too high was fueled further by the culture of elite gymnastics, which was dominated by pixies, small, underweight girls. Even her own coach made comments about her weight, which pushed her to develop anorexia nervosa. Despite many treatments and hospital visits, her weight dropped to 47 pounds, and she died in 1994 at Research Medical Center in Kansas City at the age of 22. Her death brought the issue of eating disorders within the gymnastics community to light, and many other gymnasts came forward about experiencing the exact same thing. The focus on gymnast wellness was addressed with several programs on both the national and international levels, such as educational videos, nutrition counseling, and classes to varying degrees of success. However, it should not have gotten to this point. It should not take death for USA Gymnastics to care enough to change their policies. Do we really need to be starving our young adolescent athletes who are training ridiculous hours, as much or more as a full-time job, in order for them to be as small as possible? These coaches got away with it because USA Gymnastics did not have the proper policies or protocol to deal with these types of issues. The current policies do not place any limitations on the way that coaches talk to their athletes. Due to the fact that there are no regulations regarding the way coaches speak to the athlete, this leads to coaches verbally degrading the athlete through yelling and explicit language. USA Gymnastics has enacted a safe sport policy to address emotional and physical forms of abuse. In spite of the fact that USA Gymnastics has enacted the safe sport policy, the abuse still continues to take place. Imagine if you were a young child. You were doing everything you could, your very best to try to please an adult, or maybe a coach, but it was never good enough. They're constantly yelling at you because you can't get anything right, instead of helping you. How would this make you feel? Young children are unable to rationalize well, and they may come to the conclusion that this type of behavior is normal, and then they grow up exhibiting those same behaviors as adults. Then the cycle continues. Coaches need guidelines on what is appropriate language to use when talking to an athlete. Many coaches believe in speaking to their female athletes in the same manner that they would speak to their male athletes. They argue that it motivates the athlete to take the sport more seriously. However, many female athletes, not just in gymnastics, say that this harmed them more than helped them. God made males and females differently, and we should recognize that when coaching athletes. The guidelines for coaches also fail to mention what is the appropriate procedure and guidelines for discipline. It is completely appropriate for a coach to give consequences for bad attitude and bad behavior. However, a coach should not discipline an athlete for being scared of a skill. Shouldn't we be more concerned with the character of our athletes or the future of our society rather than what skill they are able to perform? Recent studies by the American Psychological Association have found that the effects of emotional abuse can be severe on a child's health and development. In fact, the APA has concluded that children who suffer emotional abuse and neglect can sometimes have more severe mental health issues than children who suffer physical and sexual abuse. Children who experience chronic emotional abuse can suffer from anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, PTSD, and suicide. Childhood emotional abuse is strongly correlated with depression, anxiety disorders, attachment problems, and substance abuse. When physical or sexual abuse is accompanied by emotional abuse, the effects on the child can be significantly more severe. When coaches subject child gymnasts to emotional abuse, they convince them that this behavior is normal and okay. This is a dangerous path to go down because it can lead them to believing that other forms of abuse are normal and okay. You may have heard in the news at some point about the USA Gymnastics team doctor, Larry Nassar. Larry Nassar was the doctor who worked under famous coaches Marta and Bela Crowley, and who was always around Olympic athletes. He knew about the emotional abuse that the girls were going through, yet he refused to report it to the USA Gymnastics organization. He was the team doctor, so he'd be there to perform treatments on the girls, and in the process, sexually abuse them. He would groom the girls into thinking he was on their side. He would sneak food to them when their coach would starve them. He befriended them in order to get closer to them. Maggie Nichols was the first gymnast to report Nassar's abuse back in 2015. However, nothing was done until a couple of years later. If the emotional abuse from the Crowleys was stopped, Larry Nassar's predatory behaviors would have been far less effective. Emotional abuse can also lead to non-sexual physical forms of abuse. A Soviet gymnast named Elena Mikina was one of the greatest Olympic gymnasts in the 1970s. She began training with a men's gymnastics coach in order to help her excel in her career. He trained her to compete extremely difficult skills, and even got her to try new ones, which were later named after her, and even more recently banned from the sport. In 1979, while training for the World Artistic Gymnastics Championships, Mikina suffered a broken leg, which kept her out of the World Championships in Fort Worth, Texas, a competition which the Soviet team suffered its first defeat at the hands of Romania. With less than a year until the 1980 Summer Olympics to be held in Moscow, the pressure was on the Soviet team and coaches and doctors to get their previous all-around champion Elena Mikina back on her feet and ready for the games. In an interview with a popular magazine, Mikina blamed the doctors who were serving the national team for attempting to rush her back to training too soon, saying she begged them not to remove her cast and discharge her because she quotes, "They were dragging me home from home to workouts," and she knew she was not yet healed. When the doctors removed her cast against her wishes, they had her try walking on the leg. She said she knew she was walking crookedly and that something wasn't right. The doctors x-rayed the leg and discovered that the fracture had not healed properly. Mikina was rushed into surgery that afternoon, but the damage had already been done. One of the national team coaches, she said in an interview, showed up at her bed the day after surgery and outright stated that she could still train in a cast. Once more, against her wishes, the doctors removed her cast prematurely, and she returned to training for the Olympics, while beginning a strenuous workout program to lose the weight she had gained while laid up from surgery. Despite her still being injured, her coach went back to pushing her to do the most difficult skills, and even pushed her to perform a skill that was only previously performed in men's gymnastics, the Thomas Salto. She was pressured to add this element to her floor routine by her own coach and other higher-ranking Soviet coaches. She soon realized that the Thomas Salto was extremely dangerous because it depended on being able to get enough height and speed to make all the flips and mid-air twists and still land in bounds. And it took near-perfect timing to avoid either under-rotation, which is landing on the chin, and over-rotation, landing on the back of the head. She spoke of trying to convince her coach that the Thomas Salto was a dangerous element, saying, "My injury could have been expected. It was an accident that could have been anticipated. It was inevitable. I had said more than once that I would break my neck doing that element. I had hurt myself badly several times, but my coach just replied, 'People like me don't just break their necks.'" 2 weeks before the 1980 Olympic Games, she was training the Thomas Salto during practice. She under-rotated, landing on her chin, and was instantly paralyzed from the neck down. Her first thoughts when she got hurt was, "Thank God I won't be going to the Olympics." After the accident, her coach never mentioned how sorry he was about her accident. Instead, he only talked about how now the Soviet team will have a less likely chance of winning the Olympic Games. Her coach only cared about his own success and did not even think about the well-being of his athlete. Elena Mikina trusted him to teach her to be her best while also keeping her safe. Instead, he forced her to train through injuries and train skills she did not feel safe performing. Another one of these heartbreaking scenarios includes a young athlete that also trained for Alpong, the coach I mentioned earlier, named Julissa Gomez. In May of 1988, several months before the Olympics, Gomez traveled with her coach to Tokyo, Japan to compete in the World Sports Fair. During the all-around competition, she qualified for vault finals. However, observers noticed her struggle with the apparatus over the months leading to the competition, including her former coach, Bela Crowley, past and present teammates, and even her coach, Alpong. Gomez's technique on the extremely difficult vault had been described as shaky at best, and Gomez was unable to perform the vault with any consistency during practice, sometimes missing her feet on the springboard. A teammate later stated, "You could tell it was not a safe vault for her to be doing. Someone along the way should have stopped her." However, her coaches insisted that she needed to continue training the vault in order to achieve higher scores. During the warm-ups held on May 5, 1988, Gomez continued to practice the vault. As she raced towards the vault on one of her practice runs, her foot slipped off the springboard and she slammed headfirst into the vaulting horse at high speed. The resulting impact instantly paralyzed her from the neck down. A subsequent accident in a Japanese hospital, which later she became disconnected from her ventilator, resulted in severe brain damage and left her in a coma. Gomez's family cared for her for 3 years before she succumbed to an infection and died in August of 1991 in Houston. Julissa Gomez's death helped prompt new safety measures in the sport. In 1989, the International Gymnastics Federation decided to increase vaulting safety by allowing a U-shaped springboard mat used during competitions. This mat is now mandatory. We can look at these heartbreaking scenarios and see that many Olympic coaches do not care about anything but the gold medal itself. They want the best for themselves and their own reputation and do not care about how it affects their athletes. These situations could have so easily been avoided if USA Gymnastics had stricter rules and regulations regarding how coaches coach their athletes. Why is USA Gymnastics waiting until something as serious as death occurs to change their policies they know could be harmful? USA Gymnastics needs to do a better job of protecting athletes from emotional abuse because the current policies allow coaches to emotionally harm the athlete, including eating disorders, body shaming, cussing, and punishment for mental blocks. The manipulation from emotional abuse can lead to other forms of abuse, and it strips the love of the sport away from the athlete. If we put our lives into perspective, youth sports is only a small portion of it. We should instead be focusing on what will be with us for the rest of our lives, our character. I believe that what many coaches do not even realize is that it is entirely possible that no one will remember their athlete's gold medal win in 50 plus years. This is not just an issue in gymnastics. We can see this issue across many other youth sports such as basketball, soccer, baseball, and many more. In fact, 25 to 75% of youth athletes claim to have had emotionally abusive coaches. The gymnast who I mentioned earlier, Lori Hernandez, found her love for the sport again after taking a 2-year break and changing coaches. However, she still struggles to cope with the lasting effects of the emotional abuse she had encountered since she was young. I began gymnastics when I was 3 years old, and I ended up quitting before my junior year of high school. I would have competed as a level 10 gymnast, the highest level. Just like Lori Hernandez, I quit because of a coach who would constantly put me down, yell at me, and give me unreasonable punishments for having a mental block. I hated the sport, or at least I thought I did. During my junior year, I realized how much I missed it and decided to go back for my senior year. The coach I had helped me find my love for the sport again, and I ended up loving it more than I ever had. A positive coach can have a bigger impact on the athlete than most people realize. Many young athletes see their coaches more than they see their own parents. Let us make sure that we are giving these athletes a positive experience in sports where they can learn valuable life lessons and help them grow as a person. Thank you.
Thank you. We will open up the floor to questions, but I actually have one for you. So you love the sport again. Okay. So if you were going to talk to mom and dad who had a little one that was coming in, what advice would you tell them? What do they need to look for? Warning signs or questions to ask the coach before they started?
Yeah, definitely get to know the coaches beforehand and just like being aware, because for me personally, like over time it was like, it started with, oh, like I don't want to go to practice, oh, I hate this, and then it just turned into me quitting. So I would say be aware for that. And yeah.
Okay, how would you coach?
So I actually do coach. I coach ages like 3 to 8 year olds, and honestly, this was one of the reasons I chose this topic, because coaching my own athletes gave me a new perspective into it, because I wanted to coach in a way that like I wanted to be coached. And so, I'm positive with them. If they need help, I help them. And there are some times when they're like, oh, I don't want to do this because I'm scared. I go through it with them and I help them work through it rather than just giving them like consequences for not doing it. So I try to make it as positive as I can.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, so that actually happened a lot. My coach would, yell at us and everything. Honestly, it was really hard because we were all experiencing the same thing, and we all thought that it was so normal because that's kind of how the culture of gymnastics is. So now looking at it, I would say to definitely talk to other coaches who maybe aren't that way, or talk to your parents. But it's definitely hard.
So, like, as a coach, if one of your athletes were pushing himself to unhealthy limits, what would you do to help them?
That's a good question because my athletes are, like, the girls I coach are so young. I haven't really experienced that. But I would just talk to them, like, are you, be a little more reasonable, Because I think if you set unrealistic expectations for it, you get disappointed with yourself easier and, put down more if you don't reach those expectations. So.
Anyone else? I have more. So it sounds like a lot of times your self-worth can get wrapped up in how well you perform.
Yeah.
And then we're stripped away when it's not great. So, as a Christian, how do you think we could find better self-worth, even in our sport, or...
Yeah, even not just in gymnastics, like across the board with any sport, finding your worth in Christ, because that's ultimately where your identity is. Not in how much playing time you get on the court, or how well you're able to perform your skill. Your identity is in Christ. And
Anyone else? Mom, anything? She has to answer you. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to hang on to your papers. You'll need them on Wednesday, okay?